afternoon, everyone. My name is Hadar Harris, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. I want to thank you all for coming today. Today is a special day as we convene the co-directors of the Center for Human Rights, all of whom are world-renowned experts in the practice of human rights, real practitioners in the field of human rights, to have a discussion with them about the work that they have done and some reflections about the careers that they have had in the field of human rights. Often we talk at the law school about ways to get involved in human rights, different substantive areas of human rights, and yet one of the things that really defines this law school is the fact that we have really world experts in the practice and in the field of human rights that combine both scholarship and teaching and service in what they do in the field. And we oftentimes kind of take that for granted and don't provide an opportunity for our community to think about and hear from and reflect on the actual work that's done in the field by members of our own community. So today we have convened Professor Bob Goldman, Professor Herman Schwartz, Professor Juan Mendez, and Professor Rick Wilson, as well as Dean Grossman, who is on his way here from another meeting, to think a little bit and to talk a little bit about their experiences in the practice and field of human rights. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, tomorrow, because we have you captive, so I will give a short advertisement for an event that's being held, put together by the Human Rights Brief and co-sponsored by the Center and the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, an event on the challenges and opportunities for a two-state Sudan after the vote. It will be taking place at 12 o'clock in room 401, and Rebecca Hamilton, who is the special correspondent on Sudan for the Washington Post, will be here, along with Professor Juan Mendez, who will be speaking, and Suleiman Baldo, who's the director for Africa of the International Center for Transitional Justice. And so I would strongly, strongly encourage you to join us in room 401 tomorrow to talk about what's happening in Sudan today, what has been happening in Sudan over the past years, and looking forward to what will be coming in the future. With that, I want to give a few introductions to our panelists, also a thank you to Maria Lachen for her assistance in putting today's event together, and to tell you that today's event is framed with a series of questions that were developed by the Center Student Advisory Board. When we sat down last week in one of our first meetings for the new board and talked about this event, I asked them what would they most want to know. And so rather than having a free-form discussion, which none of you have been in meetings with the four of these gentlemen, but I have, and so I know that it's much better to ask them specific questions, we came up with a series of questions that we'll be using to frame our conversation today. By way of just very brief introduction for very long bios, copies of which are on the table upstairs, Professor Bob Goldman, and all of them are co-directors at the Center for Human Rights. But from 1996 to 2004, he was a member of the Organization of American States Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and was also its president. From July 2004 to July 2005, he was the UN Human Rights Commission's first independent expert on the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. In October of 2005, the International Commission of Jurists named him one of 8 prominent jurists on the Eminent Jurists panel on terrorism, counterterrorism, and human rights. He and his 7 colleagues traveled the world having hearings on terrorism and human rights, which resulted in an incredibly important study that was issued by the International Commission of Jurists. This is in addition to his scholarship and expertise in the field of international humanitarian law and human rights. Professor Herman Schwartz, who's sitting next to Professor Goldman, has done work advising numerous former Soviet bloc countries in particular on constitutional and human rights reform. In 1994 and 95, he was a member of the U.S. delegation to the UN Human Rights Commission, and in June 1993, he was one of only 4 public members of the U.S. delegation to the UN World Human Rights Conference in Vienna. In 1983, he founded and currently administers the U.S.-Israel Civil Liberties Law Program, which is designed to train and develop the human rights bar in Israel. Prior to that, did work with the ACLU Prison Project and did very important civil rights work throughout the country. Professor Juan Mendez, this is giving you all the kind of background, and then we'll get into asking the questions, is a visiting professor of law at American University, but is also the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. He's also an advisor on crime prevention to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and the co-chair of the Human Rights Institute of the International Bar Association. Until May of 2009, he was the president of the International Center for Transitional Justice. And concurrent with his duties there, the Honorable Kofi Annan, when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, asked him to be the special advisor on the prevention of genocide, something that he did from 2004 to 2007. In addition to those positions, he's a native of Argentina and has dedicated his legal career to the defense of human rights. And as a result of his involvement in representing political prisoners in Argentina, the military dictatorship there arrested him, subjected him to torture and administrative detention for more than a year, during which time Amnesty International actually adopted him as a prisoner of conscience. Finally, Professor Rick Wilson is currently the director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic here at the law school and has done a great deal of work on working with public interest advocates, working on opposition to the death penalty, and developing models of legal representation of the poor. He, through his work, has represented now 3 Guantanamo detainees, or detainees in Guantanamo, and has been very active in opposition to the death penalty, drafting an amicus brief for the European Union, which helped to overturn the juvenile death penalty in this country in the Roper v. Simmons case. So, the people sitting before you have very illustrious careers in practice of human rights. As we talk today, and we're going to try and leave time for questions and discussion as they emerge for you, I'm going to ask a series of questions again that were developed by the Student Advisory Board. And we'll start here. How did each of you get involved in human rights work, or what was your first human rights experience that you recall? Since you've got my eye, Bob, I'm going to ask you to go first.
I have to. Between college and law school, and many years ago, I had a Fulbright in Uruguay, which was the most democratic country, frankly, with the best civic culture. But after I left, succumbed to really a very brutal military dictatorship. When I was at law school, Virginia was one of the few places, along with Harvard, that really had an independent course on human rights. I took a course with Richard Lillick, and there began dealing with issues of human rights because Lillick was teaching it, and I started dealing specifically with the inter-American system. I would say that that certainly got me thinking about that. And when the coup took place, I started hearing from my friends who had been at the law school with me there in Montevideo. And I began filing cases in the 70s, about 76, before both the Human Rights Committee and the Inter-American Commission, some of which are quite famous, of the landmark cases dealing particularly with extraterritorial kidnapping and so forth. So it was one of these things. It was very much an interest, but much of it became serendipity, quite frankly. So I mean, as I said, that's basically the first kinds of involvement and so forth, with actually getting into cases and learning some substantive doctrine, which was very early on in the work both of the committee and the Inter-American Commission.
I'm sort of an outlier in this. I'm primarily a domestic civil rights and civil liberties lawyer, and that's what most of my career has been, starting with work for the ACLU on wiretapping. In terms of encounters, I was in college during the McCarthy period, had family who, through my father, died in the Holocaust. All those things tend to shape you. My first real work with the international side, which I take it is what this panel is focused on, was I was asked by the then head of Human Rights Watch, because I had been deeply involved in the prison rights movement in the late 60s and early 70s, asked me to put together a committee to look at prison conditions around the world, and to do so myself, which I did. Met people in the East Bloc countries. Then when the Velvet Revolution took place in 1989, I was quite friendly with many of the dissidents involved because of my prior visits to Czechoslovakia and Poland. And so that's how I got into most of the work I did, which was constitutional reform, focusing on human rights and constitutional structures.
Well, as Hadar has already mentioned, I started doing this work in Argentina. At that time, we didn't even call it human rights, and we didn't even know it had an international law dimension. So it was all criminal law, constitutional law, and it wasn't even all that similar to civil rights litigation in the United States, because we didn't deal with issues of discrimination or race relations, but it was more all about very serious violations of life and physical integrity that we dealt with. Then I was imprisoned and then had to go into exile, and I was desperate to help my friends that had been left behind in Argentina. And that's when I started learning about international human rights law, and I had the privilege of coming to AU and getting some academic formation on that, particularly taking the course in international law that Bob Goldman taught. And my first experience was mostly feeding information into the preparation for the mission that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights took to Argentina in 1979. And its landmark report of 1980, which is one of the highlights of the 50 years of history of the Inter-American Commission. And then a couple of years later, I was asked to write a couple of chapters to a landmark report that the ACLU and the then beginning organization Human Rights Watch wrote on El Salvador and U.S. policy towards El Salvador. I think I shared that experience with Bob also, and immediately thereafter I was hired to start a Washington presence for what is now Human Rights Watch.
I would say my experience is much like Professor Mendez's, in the sense that the sort of earliest manifestation of what of the work that I did, I wasn't called human rights, but instead I think we thought of it as civil rights or criminal law or criminal procedure. And I actually left law school to go into the Peace Corps. Wasn't sure if I was going to go back to law school when I left. Kind of did a complete turnabout as a result of the Peace Corps and my service in Panama. and came back sort of reanimated at the end of the 60s to go back into law school with a mission to work in the public interest field, and graduated to become a public defender in Illinois, where I practiced for many years. My first encounter with human rights law was after I began my teaching at CUNY Law School in New York City in 1985, and had the opportunity to go to Nicaragua with a study grant to look at the regime of the Sandinistas that was under attack in the United States. President Reagan was very hostile to it, and a lot of the NGOs in the United States were taking positions with regard to the actions of the Sandinista government, and it felt to me as though this was the first time I had encountered a legal framework that was susceptible to rigorous analysis about whether or not they were in compliance or out of compliance with human rights law. So I found myself sort of in that intersection between criminal law and international law, international human rights law, in writing one of the first articles that I wrote on international human rights law. That article, by absolute coincidence, was the topic that I chose to speak on when I came here to give a talk on being hired as a clinician in the criminal law field. And that day, there was a certain director of the International Legal Studies program, now Dean Grossman, who asked, could there be a possibility of a human rights clinic? And I thought, what a lovely idea. So after I came here in 1989, we opened the clinic, the first of its kind in the United States, in 1990, and we've now been operating for 20 plus years, tilling those fields and litigating cases in the human rights field.
The question. What is your, how did you get involved in human rights work? Or what was your first human rights experience that really shaped you?
Let me see. I think it, for me, was very, very important, the military coup that took place in Chile, September 11, 1973. There is a whole theory of knowledge that says that things exist when they are broken. You know, you don't say the motor of the car exists. I mean, you're driving it, you don't know whether it's there yet. But when does it come to life? When the motor doesn't function. So what happened with the motor? No. So we study due process, independent judiciary, the principle of the presumption of innocence, and those type of things. But they really come to life when they are broken. And not knowing whether you're going to be killed or not, whether it's going to be, I mean, what will happen with people, with you. I mean, I think that creates a special dimension. I mean, that gives a special text, color to an experience. And that was my experience in the coup that took place in September 11, 1973. As a matter of fact, it was Tuesday, September 11, 1973. So next Tuesday, September 11, I'm not stepping out of bed, because you see also here, it was Tuesday, September 11, 2001. Seeing people, I mean, that were taken away and to concentration camps that disappeared, or I mean, I think I discard with the issue that these are values in themselves, and we hear that and sometimes doesn't make sense. But there is a trend to instrumentalize everything, to think that procedures, values are a means to an end. But I had this experience that allowed me to discourage that these are ends in themselves. There's not instruments to achieve a goal. I mean, the presumption of innocence or an independent judiciary. They value, they have value by themselves. So I think the military coup in 73 was a very important experience for me from that point of view. Now, getting more personal, my father was a doctor, a director of a hospital, didn't vote even for Allende in 1970. I mean, he voted for the right-wing candidate. But he was a humanist, and when there were strikes against Allende in 73, my father refused to go to those, and because he said, you know, he was the director of an hospital, appointed before, a professor in the university, he said, I can't get medicines, I don't like my patients to die. So he was jailed, concentration camp, 3 months, torture, out of the country, in Argentina, in Mendoza for 7 months, so and so on. I had to leave my house. It was, I had been the chief of staff of the Secretary General of Government, and we were, I mean, my house was, the military came into the house, I mean, looking for me. So at that point, to see this, the breakdown of these values, I mean, it acquired a special meaning for me. So I think I cannot say it was a rational decision between becoming a tax lawyer and a human rights lawyer. I mean, it was, I felt it with everything. I mean, I became also a refugee. I discovered the value of this instrument, because you can read in the newspapers the importance of these things, but there is a different texture when there is experiential learning. I was hiding, moving from homes, from different places, in Chile, for around 3 months, and I was fortunate to get political asylum from the Netherlands. So for me, the institution political asylum has a special meaning also, because of experiential learning. That's why the Washington College of Law gives such importance to experiential learning. And not for me only, I will say not mostly for me, but there is something very important when you see that. And I realize, and again, perhaps, and I want to say that, these are not instruments to achieve a goal. The provision against torture, against disappearances, due process, the presumption of innocence, they are values in themselves. So when people give the advice, to achieve goals, you can disregard the things. I have a sense of, a different sense towards these values. Doesn't matter the color, the political opinion of people. There are some things you don't do to other human beings. I mean, that's what came out from my experience. Going even further to 1973, I think there was another thing that shaped my own life on this. In Chile, my family came to Chile from Russia. And my father believed in public education, so we went to a public school. I went to public school when I was 8 years old. My first day of classes, a group of children came to beat me because, and I could defend myself. Why? Because the dollar had gone up in Chile. And they say the dollar went up in Chile because of the Jews. The Jews monopolized the money, and the dollar, the currency of the country, is going south because of the Jews. In Chile, there are 15,000 Jews. In a country of 15 million, the map of the distribution of economic wealth is very clear in the country. There was no base for that. So I had to fight for my life when I was 8 years old, because the dollar had gone up and the peso had gone down. Then 4 years later, we had class of religion. There was a distinction between, in Chile, separation between state and religion. You did not need to go. I went to a public school. My father believed in public education. So I did not need to go to the class of religion, but they did not have a place to put me in the class of religion. So there were 45 boys, this was only school for boys, and there were 3 Jews in that class, Grossman, Kaufman, and Rusowski. Remember the name? So what happened? They put the 3 of us in the back of the room. And the priest, which name I will not forget, also Father Lira, said, "You see the 3 kids sitting on the back?" "Yeah, we see," said they are on the back because they killed our Lord Jesus. So in 4 days, I stole the money of the country, I killed God, and I was 8 years old. And I will tell you, that developed a special sensitivity when I look backwards. Because in the school, there were also some students with Araucano names. So you had the tradition, the Hispanic tradition is one language, one religion, one ethnicity. You know, very powerful coming from the Inquisition. So if you have people that are different, they miss 10%, 20%, and so forth. So you had the coalition of the Indians and the Jews. And then you had some people that came, came from very few, but they came from the Middle East. But Chile, there is a huge Palestinian population, and they were called the Turks. So you had the coalition of the Turks, the Jews, and the Indians. And then you have some students who were accused of being gay. You were 8 years old, 9 years old, they were not fine. So you had the coalition of the gays, the Jews, the Palestinians. So all the garbage of humankind together. That was the set. And when I look backwards, I have a sense that gave me a special sensitivity for issues. At that point, I did not know about my life. The only thing I knew is that I had to hit back. But that gave me a sensitivity in terms of persecuted people. You know, I also would like to say this. With the passage of time, I discovered that Rusowski and Kaufman were less important to me than Parra and Egaña and Perez. And I discovered more positive things on others. But the shaping thing at that time, we were 8 years old, and where you are accused to kill God and steal the money, and it's a heavy thing. And I think that gives you sensitivity to persecuted people. So these are, I think, shaping experiences that led me to the human rights field. Thank you. I'm not talking here on the intellectual attraction and the complexities of the law, where it's at a more existential level, I would say.
This gives you a sense of just scratching the surface of the very, very long discussion that we can have with each one of these people. But maybe the next question is compound, so you'll excuse me, and you can choose which side of it you'd like to pick, which is what do you point to as your biggest success in human rights work or your greatest disappointment? Bob.
Well, it's been over about 40-some years, so it's a good deal to choose from, I guess. But briefly, on the human level, something does stick out. In 1977, I participated in the first mission that the military government of Uruguay permitted. And it was a very bad situation in the country at the time. The country had carried out a policy in neighboring countries of kidnapping, and particularly in Argentina, combined operations. In some 120-some Uruguayans and so forth had been forcibly abducted, and the status of some of these persons were not known. On the basis of the trip, we were able to find out until the parents, right before Christmas, of 2 Uruguayans' families, that their children were alive. And that's something very, very special. I would say that on a different level, having argued and framed a good deal of the legal arguments and having won the first amnesty cases, getting the Uruguayan amnesty law struck down the first case ever, together with the cases against Argentina. And they kind of pioneered the work in this field, and certainly Juan was involved with those with me. When I was with America's Watch and with Juan Mendez, when Juan was the executive director, I think when we pioneered the introduction of law of war methodology, which was extremely important for our credibility in our work in the wars in Central America. We changed the whole face of human rights law. It was really resisted, but it's ordinary now. But we did this together back in '82. And then I'd say that the last thing in terms of my work at the Commission, and I should note that Juan Mendez was also for 4 years a member and a former president of the Inter-American Commission. Glad I could work both with him, but when Claudio and I were together on the Commission, and particularly when I was president, what pleased me most, and I think the greatest success, was our work both on cases and particularly on preparation of a report on Peru. We did the work that led to the beginning of the end of the Fujimori government, when the political organs of the OAS would not take their job seriously. It was our reporting, our sending of cases, our fast-tracking of cases. And the work that we did, and particularly to release the report at the General Assembly at Windsor, it marks the beginning of the end of that terrible, terrible government. And so I was proud of the work, frankly, that Claudio and our other colleagues and I could do together on that. So those are some. We just mentioned that failure. The thing that I regret the most was that I didn't argue well enough before the Inter-American Court in the preliminary objections in the Palmeiras case to persuade them that the Inter-American Commission indeed was competent to utilize the law of armed conflict, both at times to apply it directly, at times as being peremptory norms, or alternatively to inform their interpretations of the American Convention. I would note, however, that the court has softened its view on this, particularly after I left the Commission.
Rick, let's go out of order.
Hadar mentioned in introducing me probably, certainly one of my proudest moments in advocacy, and that was authoring actually the third of a series of amicus briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court having to do with the death penalty, starting working with the European Union in the mid-'90s and persuading the Union that it was okay to appear in a U.S. court and speak on legal questions that it felt very cautious about doing with a close ally. Persuading it that it was a good idea for it to weigh in on this important question. By the time we got to Roper versus Simmons, the case involving the death penalty against children, the coalition had gone far beyond the Union, so that actually the brief was signed onto by a group of some 48 countries. So it was both an organizational triumph and a legal triumph in the sense that the brief, I think, without question, had influence on the majority of the court. I think I was both delighted to see it referred to in the majority opinion in the text, and equally delighted to read Justice Scalia's rants against it in his dissent. So that was by far and away the greatest triumph. And ever so briefly on disappointments, I think the struggle to represent Omar Khadr in Guantanamo over the period of time from 2004, when lawyers were permitted to go, through the time that we were summarily fired in 2007, that was probably the most frustrating and multi-dimensional legal representation that I've ever done, and I did it with a colleague from the clinical program here at American. So it was good to have somebody else to work on it with, but it was so demoralizing to make visits to Guantanamo and to feel as though I was climbing the mountain every time I visited with Omar to begin to regain his trust after the previous visit, that he was influenced by the voices around him so much more than by the periodic visits of lawyers from the United States, that it always felt as though we had to start from scratch when we began to talk to him about his case and where it was going. And of course, the courts in the United States were not responsive. The U.S. Supreme Court was, but the lower courts uniformly rejected their cases. So the sense that we were trying to animate him to be encouraged about his possibilities, at the same time that the reality was that we were losing over and over and over again in the U.S. courts, was an incredibly difficult and ultimately, I think, demoralizing experience.
Okay. Let me see. I think at the general point, at a higher level of abstraction, big success is to have contributed to the defeat of dictatorship, military dictatorship in the Western Hemisphere. I think that was it. I live in the Netherlands, where I was a political refugee for around 10 years. And in the Netherlands, you know, with my Dutch colleagues in the University of Utrecht, we created a foundation for the legal aid. I did lobby in the United Nations for the democracy in the region, and in Geneva and in New York, while I was working in the University of Utrecht. So, I mean, and here in the United States, when I came in 1982, again, we continue to work towards against this political system of dictatorship in the region. There was generalized dictatorship in the region. I mean, we can explore the reason for that, and to have and I contributed to the defeat of that. Now, in terms of cases, I think that there are different cases, and I feel honored to have participated in some. With one, we participated in the Manfredo Velázquez case. Was the first case in the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. We were not in the commission at that time. We were lawyers here in Washington, and we took the case of Manfredo Velázquez on Duran that disappeared, and that was the first case before the Inter-American Court. And there is something so valuable in the fact that the first case was a case of disappearance. And Manfredo Velázquez had the sad honor to be the first internationally recognized person, through a legal process in the Inter-American Court. So that was very important. Then in the commission, later on, when I was elected, I participated in different cases that were that I feel honored to have contributed to those. One was killing of children. This is a case, Villarán and others. In some countries on earth, it's not good to be a child. The merchants in Guatemala City will pay the police to kill the children. You can see how misery, and and what's worse is that those things appear like normal. There is a sense of that this happens. The children are not angels. No, they steal, they commit crimes, but certainly we don't need to talk why this is a horrendous crime. So we had, I participated in that case, and it was for me a big satisfaction to see that justice was done there. There were other cases. I participated a lot in cases concerning Guatemala. I am not convinced that there was a dramatic change that ensured human rights in the future in Guatemala, but at least we achieve a measure of justice in individual case. Another case that was very important for me, didn't become a case, was a case in Paraguay that I negotiated with the Paraguayan government. These were two Argentinians, a husband and a wife, who would be responsible. One was a doctor of a hospital where Peronista women, Montonero women, I mean these were opposing the military dictatorship in Argentina, will give birth, they will be killed, and the children will be given for adoption or sold. And then these two individuals were found in Paraguay. And I was the rapporteur on Paraguay in the Inter-American Commission, and I negotiated with the government of Paraguay the extradition of these individuals to Argentina. You know, and that I think these are individual things. I mean, the key thing is to have participated in a process that led to the democratic transformation of the region. But I think in individual things, if you ask me, I think some cases where I felt a special satisfaction was the case of the children in Guatemala, the children I mean, the chance of having the abuelas to recover, because the key thing was to discover who was related to her. In terms of disappointment, there have been many. One, you know, the senseless of brutality. How people are killed like flies for nothing, and you can. So it's easy to become disappointed with this. Because if you see the number, the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that get killed for nothing. I mean, in the sense of, you know, for pure brutality, and then to have a sense that how futile is that? How it doesn't serve? I mean, it's in addition to the value the issues at stake. So the fact that we could not effect the transformation soon enough, perhaps. Now, there have been other disappointments, but that's for another story. I mean, we always have lost some cases. I mean, all of us have had cases where we have lost, but that would be for the next discussion, I would say. Okay, thank you.
Herman.
Well, that's a rather difficult question for me because, as I said before, most of my work has been domestic. I guess the most satisfying and surprisingly effective thing I've done is, in a sense, to start the program that turned out to have created the Jewish-Israeli and Arab-Israeli bar, human rights bar in Israel. In the 26 years, we've graduated about 50 or more lawyers who have, I think it's fair to say, and this I had nothing to do with except to think up the program and with Hadar's help administer it, to, in a sense, create a whole human rights structure within Israel, including problems with the territories and the like. Since most of my other international work was working on constitutional reform in the former East Bloc and a little bit elsewhere, I'm unsure where to rank that, whether in the category of success or failure. My brother Goldman here, when I mentioned, or Hadar mentioned the work on that, said, well, that'll fall under the failure category. As it happens, it's hard to know what my contribution was to either success or failure, but it is one of the most exciting things I've ever done, and that's one of the great things about working in the international human rights field, because the last, as you've heard from the members of the panel, the last 30 or 40 years have seen enormous advances, enormous setbacks, but it's been very exciting to be a part of that. I guess my greatest sense of failure is domestic, and that is that I devoted a very, very intense 5 years of my life to prison litigation and reform in this country. My work overseas was essentially studying and writing reports with a group of others. But I devoted a great deal of that time to prison reform from 1969 to 1975. And we failed. I and my colleagues, pretty much. You just have to look around you. So I guess that's it.
Well, successes in this field are always partial and temporary. It's like the myth of Sisyphus. You always push up and then all of a sudden everything comes crashing down on you and you have to start all over again. But I can say that I did derive some personal satisfaction out of relatively unimportant events, like, just the face of a mother that I went to see to tell her that her son, who was facing a really long and difficult prison term, was going to be released for lack of evidence. Unfortunately, a couple of years later, he was arrested again, and he is counted among the disappeared. And then decades later, I found a friend of mine who was in prison with me, and in my capacity as a jailhouse lawyer, I had told him how to preserve his rights to appeal, and as a result of that, he credits me with his prison term being reduced to what could have been 19 years was reduced to 5 or something. As you can imagine, in both cases, these are not particularly, great legal strategies or professional achievements, but they do give me a sense of personal satisfaction. I was going to mention both the Velázquez-Rodriguez case that Claudio mentioned and the incorporation of laws of war into human rights fact-finding and monitoring and advocacy that Bob mentioned. I have to say, in the case of Velázquez, one deep sense of disappointment that I have is that we produced a star witness who was a defector of the Honduran Battalion 316, which was a unit that tortured and killed people. And we really, it was a fantastic testimony, and I had to persuade him to come. He was seeking asylum in Canada. Canada allowed him to go to Costa Rica and go back. We had to make sure that he didn't stop in any American port because he thought that the CIA, who had trained him, was going to kidnap him. Then years later, he was still fighting for asylum in Canada, and Canada had a very harsh interpretation of the rule that says that people who participate in the persecution of others cannot obtain asylum. And I was asked to go back to Canada to testify, to explain the nature of his participation in 316 and how he had succeeded in breaking it and everything, and that should merit some consideration, but to no avail. He was denied asylum, and before leaving Canada, he left a letter saying that the only way to protect his family was for him to commit suicide, and he killed himself. And I felt very responsible for it. As you can see, some of these failures are ways of us blaming others for them rather than oneself. But if they're not failures, at least they score as disappointment. When I was a president of the Inter-American Commission in 2002, we had a couple of very significant decisions to make. One was the precautionary measures on Guantanamo, in which we asked the government of the United States to allow the determination of status of each of the Guantanamo detainees to be done by a court of law, something that 2 years later the Supreme Court said as well. And the same year, we wrote a really excellent report on terrorism and human rights, which I think, together with several others that have come later, stands as a very good explanation of how terrorism can and should be fought within the rule of law and respecting human rights and international humanitarian law as well. In both of those cases, as you can see, I'm taking credit for work of others, but I think most of the greatest successes that I can point to are when I work together with Bob, with Claudio, with other members of the Commission and staff of the Commission that I'd like to remember right now as having been very influential in the quality of both of those pieces of work. And then finally, again, with respect to failures or disappointments, I have to mention my stint as the Special Advisor to Kofi Annan on the prevention of genocide. I'd rather talk about it like a learning experience, like a challenge, all those words to avoid the word failure. But in fact, the fact that the promise of a mechanism by which the international community can be made aware of situations that, if left unattended, can degenerate into genocide, and that with that mechanism then the international community would be ready to act. Unfortunately, that promise has not been realized, and my access to the Security Council, for example, was much more limited than I would have wanted it to be. Again, nevertheless, I think the last word has not been said. It's not a question of being defeatist about it. I think we have to be very patient when we do human rights work, and we have to test the successes and the failures over longer periods of time and not immediate success or failure.
Because we only have about 20 minutes left, and I do want to leave time for your questions, I'm going to open the floor to questions, but also leave a final question that maybe somebody wants to ask. Your careers, the work that you all have done when sitting as a law student and listening to it is the stuff of legend. And for many law students, sitting and listening to everything that you're talking about, it seems very inaccessible, or something that they dream about doing later on down the line. And all of us are asked on a daily basis, what's your advice for being able to do the work that you've done? Or maybe I'm never going to do the work that you've done, but how do I get into the field of human rights? And so lots of us have the same advice, really standard things like, network, go to events that are here, use Washington, D.C., meet as many people as possible, take international law as soon as you can, and then take all the other things that are interesting. But what other kinds of advice might you give to students who are seeking to enter the field of human rights? I often tell people careers in human rights are not linear. You don't get your first job. It's not like a law firm where you get your first job and then you progress and you make partner at a certain point. I think that you've heard from the experiences that everyone has talked about, and my own, certainly at a much lesser scale, echoes much of that in terms of, things happen in the world, and you get involved oftentimes by circumstance or by happenstance, and so a career in human rights often sort of happens, and then at a certain point it happens to you, and then it happens with you. But what might be some of your advice that you would give to students who are seeking to enter the field of human rights? And as you think about that, maybe there might be some other questions as well. You have comments now, and anyone who has a question can come to the microphone as well. But since they don't, you can answer that question.
I think if you're interested in any field like this, whether domestic, international, or whatever, I think you should go to people and organizations who are doing it and tell them you want to work with them. The first, I think, piece of, in my case, civil rights and civil liberties work grew out of my contacting a Jewish organization that I was practicing law in New York that wanted somebody to do a study of discrimination against Jews and blacks in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. And then later I met friends from the ACLU and got involved in some of their work. And from then it was simply taking the initiative and going to the people who do it and offer to help and get involved in some way.
I think in today's world it's very important to have field experience, and the good thing is that now there's much more opportunity for having field experience. So it's a little bit of a hardship, but it's also fascinating work, and I would really recommend people, enlisting to go, for example, to UN missions or even NGO missions, including humanitarian organizations that don't do specific human rights work, but all of the relief organizations now have what they call a protection specialist. And basically what they do is they take notes on human rights violations that they witness and try to discern how to pass them on to other agencies and organizations that can do something about them. And that becomes really good day-to-day, but also very practical experience. And the other thing that I would say is that human rights work has become much more diversified now than it was when any one of us started. And you need to do a little bit of specialization yourself. For example, if you want to do litigation, there are organizations that all they do is litigate before the Inter-American system or the European system or the universal system of protection. There is also obviously the whole burgeoning field of international criminal justice that gives very much of an opportunity to work with the ICC or with the other tribunals, or even just following and reporting on them. There's a whole cottage industry of organizations that follow what's going on in those tribunals. And even beyond that, there's the diversification and specialization with the perspective of especially vulnerable groups, indigenous groups, women, children. They have revolutionized the way we do human rights work generally, and at the same time opened all kinds of doors to doing the work in slightly different ways. And the most important thing is that they bring to the human rights movement wider and wider circles of people with expertise and with professional abilities that some years ago would not have had an occasion to work on human rights.
Well, I would certainly agree with what Juan said. What I think, of course, what was available when I was a law student or when I first came in '71 to the law school, there is hardly a right you can think of for which there is not a non-governmental organization in a network. And the amount of rights, I mean, a good deal of us, I think it's fair to say maybe that many of us here, we had to spend a good deal of our time in dealing with, civil and political. And those were the big issues in the recovery of democracy and so forth, or problems in Eastern Europe. And the economic, social, and cultural rights, of course, now are much more focused on. But there's interrelationships in areas dealing with specific kinds of rights, vulnerabilities, the environment, and so forth, and civil and political. It just cuts across. It's remarkable. Anyone of us who've been within the UN system will see when you go to the commission, or what was the old commission, or now the Human Rights Council, and you see how many accredited NGOs around the world. It is just, it's mind-boggling. And there is huge opportunities. I would say this, I think that you need to avail yourself of as many of the core courses as you can, because it's a competitive field, frankly, and you have to have the kind of doctrinal background. But I think the field experience is also extremely important. It does give a dimension. But there are many opportunities with internships, externships, and volunteering and so forth that one can do to get the experience. So you have really a lot more choice than many of us did. And you will also see that so much is, I mean, it's like serendipity. I mean, you start doing something, and you do something, and then you get called on to do another thing, and the next thing you know, you become the resident expert on that country, or you know something about this, and that expertise is wanted, but you build the capacity and so forth. But, you know, there's a tremendous opportunities, and I think you're at one of the right places. That the school's reputation, I think, is something that's certainly affiliated with the school, and studying human rights and humanitarian law here is not exactly going to be a detriment to your, you know, to your career.
Yeah, I think Juan's observation about field work carries with it kind of the implicit suggestion that field work isn't litigation, hardly ever. And I think one of the things we've tried to deal with in the clinical experience is to think about human rights work in a much more broad range of activities, lawyering activities, advocacy activities. I think when you heard us talking about our experiences, a lot of us draw on our experience in litigation, our successes in a case, as the defining moments. But I would say human rights work today in the NGO world and in government work in human rights is as much different forms of advocacy that have to do with field missions and report writing and public education, media advocacy, and all kinds of other work that lawyers do to shine the light on issues that include kinds of advocacy beyond litigation itself. So I think thinking of yourself as an advocate writ large, other than just a litigator, it opens the doors for more possibilities. And I think similarly, a lot of my own students think about human rights work in a broad context, just in the same way that we described our own coming to human rights, and my own sense that my work as a public defender was human rights work in its own way. And I think many folks feel as though their work as prosecutors, as public defenders, as immigration lawyers, as people who are defending rights in whatever context they work in, are doing human rights work. So that it opens the field more broadly if you conceive of it in the broadest possible way. I mean, it's lovely to be able to work with international norms and international bodies, but and I think it's true that there have been many more openings just in the past couple of decades, many more possibilities for those of you who are graduating now to do that kind of work that weren't available even those few years ago. But the work is still relatively limited in the NGO field, and so I think thinking about these other options and the ways of doing advocacy in service is another way of thinking about doing human rights work.
I'm just going to use the prerogative to also just add one more thing to what Rick was saying, which is to think about not just broadly the work beyond litigation and advocacy, but also thinking about the work in terms of breaking down this dichotomy of international human rights and civil rights work in the United States. One of the things that we've been really involved in is creating a human rights movement in the United States. And so you can do human rights work here at home as well, and to look at it broadly in that way. I'm going to give the final word to Dean Grossman before we open to questions.
Well, I find this question very difficult always, because I wonder why I find it difficult. First of all, because I never follow advice in my life so easily. Second thing, because our generation doesn't have a good record of doing things well or anticipating things that happen, and we live in a situation of dynamic change. I mean, granted, in a different type of environment, you see how many people anticipated here the situation in Egypt or in Tunisia? How many anticipated the end of the Cold War? I mean, and what's the relevance of this? That we live in a moment of changing circumstances. I mean, it's enough to see the film Social Connections. What's the name of the film? Social Network. You see all these new millionaires that are very young people.
Billionaires.
Trillionaires, whatever. I mean, so they have invented their own thing. So this is like when you look at the statements by Merrill Lynch, if it exists any longer, or Bank of America, it says past performance does not guarantee that the investment will behave in the same way. So the only thing that we can do is to share our experiences. The world is changing very rapidly. It took 1,800 years to double human knowledge from the beginning of the Common Era to the 19th century. In the year 2040, we will be doubling human knowledge every 72 days. So this is a very dynamic situation now. So, and I at least don't have any credibility. Some of the most important things that have happened to me have not been foreseen in any way. So you cannot plan a lot of things. I guess, it helps to have a rich parents, so you can do what you want. So if you can do that, do it, if it is not too late. And, another option is, rich partner. I mean, don't make the mistake I made. No, but other things, I mean, are general guidelines and everyone has to discard. I think opening yourselves for opportunity, keeping your eyes open. Reality surprises us with things that, and if you have a tunnel vision and everything, very, very clearly determined as to what's the next step, no. Something happened. Look at human relationships. When you ask people, well, the partner, wife, spouse, partner, whatever that they met, it's a chance. They went to a bar because they needed to, change in coins, and they met someone for the rest of their lives. I mean, so being open for opportunity, I think, is very, very important. Not to have a tunnel vision. Something surface you that could make a tremendous difference in your life. Another thing, it's not a zero-sum game, and there are moments in life. Many people, I don't know why, get tired of being poor. You get tired of having to pay thousands of dollars in terms of debts. And then they see this human rights work as a zero-sum game. Yeah? So, or I am 100%, I am not 100%. Well, sometimes it's not possible to be 100%. You can be in a certain moment in your life 3%, through an NGO and through voluntary work. But if your expectation is I will have a full-time job in human rights all the time, well, it's not possible, but then you keep your link to the thing. I mean, looking at opportunity. There are moments where you pay your debts, moments that, So, and I will say this, when people commit themselves 100% thinking it's a D-Day, I mean, where you put all your efforts in the conquest of Europe, and the situation called not by an all-out assault, but a guerrilla war, where you don't commit all your resources, only part of them. because there are no conditions. I mean, they will be interested in human rights longer than if you put all your resources, you didn't get the 100% job that you wanted, and then you need to pay debts and you're out of it. I mean, I don't think there are many jobs that pay 100% for human rights work, right? Very few. So, and people have debts and so forth. So sometimes you go through phases in life also. I think it's important to keep a finger, 2, 3, depends on the conditions, to a human rights community. There are possibilities of voluntary work. Even if you leave the law school, you know, we have an impact litigation project. You can do things with the Center of Human Rights. So and if you get the job 100% in human rights, that's fine. That's what you want. If you don't, you can continue being linked with the human rights community and contribute. It is not a zero-sum game, waiting for other options in a certain moment. Then, I totally agree with what my colleagues say. Sometimes the technical expression, human rights work, is narrowly construed. You can do human rights work in the many agencies of the U.S. government. You can do human rights work in the military. You can do human rights work. I mean, in many, you can do, I mean, and again, you can also volunteer 2% of your time. I mean, and some years you cannot, next year you can. But always, I think it's important to keep this idea of voluntary work also alive. Right? And look for conditions and opportunity. I mean, I think that having a sense of opportunities, I think is a very important advice. And I haven't ever listened to advice, so I granted that we don't have a lot of credibility now, as my generation. Other thing, to increase opportunity, language knowledge is important. If you speak only one language, English is the language to speak. That has been settled, stipulated, and so forth. But I think that learning our languages and could open opportunity, because what you want is opportunities coming your way and recognizing opportunity. So I think that, again, if I think language knowledge is important. We have externships in the law school that, because that's the key thing. You cannot control everything. And then what you want is to be in places that offer you possibilities, because that could change your life. So the externships, you know, can put the foot in some place. You can learn from people. And I think that, you know, Avi Sanders is an important person here, and to see where you can do things. Networking, very important. A lot of things happen in conversation. A German philosopher, Heidegger, said once that the language is the house of being. I mean, that has different layers of meaning. But through language, we create opportunities. So you want to be in conversation with many people. And your generation is good at that because you can do it technologically through the many possibilities that have been created. But I think being in conversation with people and with an eye of opportunities are very, very important. And life can bring you to situations that you never thought that were possible. And a lot of things happen because of being in conversation and seizing an opportunity. I think that is maximizing conversation with people. I think is crucial to work in this field and in other fields as well. Thank
you. We have a few minutes if there are questions from the floor. Please, just make sure that the microphone's on. It may or may not be. There we go.
It's on, so. My name's Kate. Thanks so much for speaking to us today. I had a question about, I feel like a lot of the panelists touched on personal connection as a highlight from your careers. And something that I think about is the difference between providing direct services and having interactions with victims of crime or different things, as opposed to policy work, where you don't actually have the talking to people and interaction with people affected. And so how do you maintain that passion in something that seems really disconnected with impact litigation or higher profile cases? How do you maintain that connection when you're not directly connected to the community?
First of all, we're not the Oracle of Delphi with answers to all the questions. I mean, I'm tempted to say in the classic Socratic tradition, what do you think about them? But I would say, some people some people are attracted by having clients working in NGO and so forth and so on and defending very concrete clients and so on. Other people are attracted by policy work and policy work, and they see their contribution in terms of, in macro terms, I would say, and they don't need. That doesn't make them, and perhaps sometimes they have a huger impact than strategic litigation. I don't think that they get disconnected from human beings by the fact that they are attracted by state policy and so on and so on. And I think that depends on the motivation of human beings. So I don't think that necessarily working in policy means that you get detached from human beings.
I sympathize with your question because when I was doing a lot of work in different aspects, I found personally that unless I got into contact with the people with whom I was defending or trying to improve things, whether it was school desegregation or prisons or so on, I found that it was necessary sort of to touch earth every so often and see what you were doing. I agree with the Dean that there may be other people who don't, who find policy analysis sufficiently rewarding. But I think that particularly in human rights work, as you may have heard from the panel here, all of us, I think, found personal connections with people who were suffering a rather crucial part of what we did. And so I think one ought to seek out opportunities for that. And as the Dean said, I assume many of you have heavy debts, student loans and the like, in which case volunteer, work in community organizations that either work with refugees, work with immigrants, work with people directly if you can.
There are many people who I think we all were pretty lucky as a group. One of the great experiences, that we all had, certainly as members of the Inter-American Commission, that we were constantly doing field work. We were drafting the cases, reports, and so forth with staff, but at the same time, and we were arguing cases, all of us were delegates before the court. But then at the same time, we were doing, as rapporteurs, each of us had 3-4 countries or whatever and so forth, and we were constantly traveling to those countries. We were in the field. We were doing things. We were certainly the work with Human Rights Watch. It was a unique period when Juan was the head of America's Watch, and I think something like this will never happen again, but it was the board that actually did the missions with staff. That just doesn't happen anymore. And we were there, and we were on the ground. But you see, it's getting very specialized today. You have people who are nothing but researchers and people who do nothing but appellate briefs, and then there are people who are expert out all the time in the offices. They're gathering information and they're doing it. Doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive. But the fact is, you have the opportunities to do it. I'll say like Herman, I did not get nearly the satisfaction out of writing or researching and so forth for the United Nations as I did going into the jungles in Colombia, showing the flag and then realizing they had to be under provisional measures and getting the satisfaction to know that the provisional measures that we put on at the end of the day has probably saved those people there from being wiped off the face of the earth. And it saved some lives. It was far more satisfying to me than, writing a report that's going to be cited by a lot of graduate students and so forth. But you have these opportunities today, and they are different skills, but I think it's important to know, just mention the kinds of things that are done today and you can learn at this law school, like how to interview. I never had a class like that. It's extraordinary what you can learn now in terms of your litigation. I never had a class like that. And I went to one of the, top 5 law schools in the United States. We had nothing like this. And I had to watch other people, and I was basically present at the creation of the human rights movement in large measure. You have so many opportunities to learn things in clinics and litigation and how to interview properly and so forth, and then as well as the doctrinal things, so you can gain a lot of these skills. But as I said, a lot of this is open to you, but I don't view them as mutually exclusive. A lot of it's going to depend on you personally, what you enjoy, and that's what's at the end of the day so important. If you like writing briefs, that's very important, but you may not.
I'm going, unless you have one wrap-up word, because I know people have to go to class. Exactly. So just in wrapping up, I think that we started, Dean Grossman talked about human rights as values. And where you hear the work that has been done by the members of our faculty, and this is only one cross-section of people who've shared their experiences with you. It's really important to recognize the fact that as we talk about human rights work, we're also talking about living human rights lives, integrating these values into the things that we do on a day-to-day basis in our work, whether it is in a private sector firm doing pro bono work, whether it is sitting on a board, on a committee, whether it is going into the jungles and into the fields and in defending refugees. But there are many, many, many ways to do this work, and everyone has an accessible point of entry, whether you are a law student now or whether you seek to go into the field in the future. I want to thank our panelists for the work that they've done, the people that they are, the integration that they do in human rights work. It's a privilege for me to be working with you all on a daily basis, most of the time. Pretty much most of the time. And to thank all of you for being here and sharing this with us today. Thank you.